Welcome to this discussion. This is the first of our discussions on sort of homiletical approaches to the book of Colossians. And we really have a good bit of material to cover today because we want to talk about approaching the whole series. And then the first big chunk, actually a couple big chunks of chapter 1. And for Tim, that was 3 sermons. For me, it's 2. But we really want to think about how we saw the series coming together, and then we'll look at more specifics of those passages. So let's think about themes of the series and what we found important and how we began to put this together. So for me, it was just this word that shows up many times in this book. And especially we could look at chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. In that just 2 verses, it reads like this: "For in Christ all the fullness of deity lives in bodily form. And in Christ you have been brought to fullness. He is the head over every power and authority." Now, this is another one of those passages, and I've talked about this in the first lecture and then in 1:15-20, where Paul has a really high Christology. Remember, Christology is the study of who Christ is, what Jesus is, how he's related to God, what he does for us, all those issues. And this is another place where Paul really lifts up who Jesus is. And that word fullness shows up in verse 9, and then it shows up again in verse 10. The first time, Christ is the fullness of deity. So everything that God is, Jesus is, okay? Every bit of God is at work in Jesus. But then we have the line that tells us, in Christ, you have been brought to fullness. Now, that word fullness can be translated in lots of different ways, and we see it translated in more than one way in the New Testament. And one of the ways it can be translated is completeness, or even perfect. That's another way to think of it. But that word complete really struck me, and how we are made complete by Jesus. And I think part of Paul's point is that's the way it happens. It's not anything that we can do. And some of the false teaching that I think he deals with is saying, hey, there's other paths to completeness, other paths to fullness. Well, what Paul wants his original readers to note is that we are made complete only in Jesus. So that was the beginning, just the spark of preaching for me for this whole series. So that's where it started. And then I had to do the work of breaking it down. So I don't know if you had a spark or what you thought of in terms of the whole series, Tim, but maybe you can lay out a little bit of that, of how you saw the series coming together.
Well, 2 things. One is James and I decided to do some work on Colossians together. It was kind of his vision first. And I was wandering in the wilderness trying to figure out what I was going to do in the fall series of 2021. And so I pretty quickly adopted his theme of complete. Partially, I don't know if I were going into it completely on my own, if that's
right.
The theme I would have landed on. It may have been something like the Christ exalted or something like that, both of which are tied into the series.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also liked his artwork.
Which is not anything I did.
Which is a person on his staff, I believe.
Yeah, right.
So, and for me in my culture, we use PowerPoint, we use slides, we use logos as a way of helping to display our preaching and what we're doing, our themes as we develop our themes. And so I latched onto that as well. And secondly, James is better at overview, I think, in many ways, and sketching than I am, or at least in this case. I tend to get into the nuts and bolts and deal with the individual verses and the words and trying to glean from the text in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if it makes sense, but I think you do a better job with a broad view, and I do the microcosm versus the macrocosm sometimes.
It reminded me that
Christ being exalted, complete, fullness, are all there in
Absolutely.
Colossians.
And we can talk a little bit about that as we think about how possible approaches. It just reminds me that in my brief introduction in our first discussion, I didn't cover some ancient history that was probably before virtually any students who would listen to this might have been before they were born. Is that years ago when Tim and I were in seminary, and then just after we sort of moved in different directions geographically, we worked on series together for several different years, and over the years we at times have, collaborated and preached on the series, and then times we go our own way. And with that said, I would encourage that to students, and if nothing else, sometimes just to talk about what you're thinking about. So even if the other person's preaching something totally different, sometimes verbalizing it either out loud like this, or sending an email or a message or whatever saying, I'm thinking about this, if we get it out there, sometimes that just makes it coalesce a little bit, but to get the reaction from the other person. But I think that was helpful to both, or was to me anyway, right? In my early preaching, is to have somebody to help with a few ideas. And plus, I think Tim will echo this as well. Both of us have been at this a while. And after preaching 30 years, sometimes you just don't have a new idea, and it's good to lean on someone. And that doesn't mean you don't take the idea and do something on your own with it. And certainly Tim has. We didn't preach the same sermons by any means. But there's times when I've needed just an idea for something. And it's good to have a friend who, has preached some other stuff and can sometimes help with that. So anyway, you can connect with people, especially early on in your ministry. I would encourage that. And I'm pretty sure Tim would be with me on that.
Yeah, let me add a couple
go ahead.
things to that. I just got an email. I send out my emails, my sermons via email to a very small select group. Those who have not told me not to. And but I one of them about a month ago said, well, I'm not preaching your stuff, you can take me off the list. Well, A, I don't expect them to preach my stuff.
Right.
And B, I'm getting stuff from other people. Stuff. That's a technical word, by the way. I'm getting sermons from at least one other person. I'm not preaching his stuff, but they're in my files. If I have time to skim them, I can get an illustration. The more resources you have, the better. You don't want to be stealing other people's stuff, though I have preached other people's other ministers' sermons and given credit for them. The second thing I would add to what James said about preaching in general and collaborating was, and I think I've already suggested it, which I don't know if I got a lot of help on individual sermons when James and I were working together. And some, because our styles were closer back then than they are now. But the whole sitting down 3 or 4 times a year and mapping out where we were going and coming up with ideas for themes and sermon series was for me invaluable. And I've already suggested he's in many ways better at the broad view. Having said that, it was that interaction of, well, where are we going? What can we preach on? What book of the Bible do we want to focus on? What themes do we need to work on? That was invaluable to me, because I'm okay week to week, but sometimes it's like, what am I going to do 2 months from now?
Yeah. And it's hard. I mean, because you don't always have a spark of an idea, and you still got to preach. So, it's got to come from somewhere. And Tim and I occasionally have, used at least the idea of a book out there. I mean, maybe we've taken some individual topics for sermons. I don't know that either one of us would preach through somebody's book, but to get ideas from it, we've done that. So there's all kinds of things out there that, are available to us. It's just, we've always enjoyed coming up with our own stuff too. So, when we can, we certainly do. And I think we've got an upcoming discussion where we'll talk a little more about that. And I probably jumped the gun on some of that now, but we're old enough that we might forget and you'll hear it again. So that'll be okay too.
I would say in 2020 and 2021, I preached material from other people's books. And in 2020, I wrote a book. based
There you
on
go.
science. There you go. You can find it on Amazon.
Right.
But by the time you get done putting it in your words,
Right.
you know, one of them was a John Ortberg book that if I had preached it word for word, we'd have been there an hour and a half. And in my church and my culture, that would not have worked.
No.
So,
No, saying I did an Ortberg book a few years ago too, and I was the same way. I mean, I took the idea, but I went in very different directions. Well, let's think about Colossians and that series that we both preached a series on Colossians, and as I've said in some of the introductory material, that was what brought about this course, was the thinking, okay, this has been meaningful to me. I think it was meaningful to our church, and this is a way of looking at preaching, and I think this is such a great, it's just a powerful book to study. So there's lots of ways that you could come at a book of the Bible to preach. Tim hasn't heard me talk about this, but in one of the lectures, I talked about how Colossians is a book that it's relatively easy, I think, to preach through. In other words, just to go through the text, divide it up in pieces, and preach those pieces. On the other hand, I preached through First John recently, and I think I would find it very difficult to preach First John that way, because John keeps circling through similar themes rather than, you know, being progressive all the way through. He brings up the same thing over and over. So I ended up preaching that topically. I think both those are biblical approaches to preaching, but they're very different based on the text that we're using. We both chose this time to work our way through the book. So
I don't know if you remember, I apologize for interrupting.
No,
I don't know if you remember, but we worked on First John together, I think.
We did. We
ended up getting halfway through to chapter 3 and realizing we got to stop because we're repeating everything again.
You do the same thing.
That 2 years later, which is what I did, and picked it up at verse 6 or verse 7 of chapter 3, preach it again. That's okay. Right. But to do it all in a period of 10 or 12 weeks would be very,
it'd get redundant, I think.
Redundant. Yeah.
So as we both use this rubric, if you will, of complete, I think Tim is right. There are certainly other ways of preaching through Colossians, because completeness is not the only theme that runs through the book. In some ways, completeness focuses more on what the power of Jesus does in my life. Okay. Tim already mentioned that another way to look at this would be to talk about the supremacy of Christ. That wasn't the word you used. I don't remember exactly how you worded it, but
exalted Christ.
There you go. Okay. Like so that would be certainly another way of looking at Colossians and the theme that runs through Colossians, just like completeness does. So that would be another possibility if you were preaching through Colossians. And Tim, seeing the course outline, he knows that the students are going to have to develop a series and then a sermon and preach that sermon. So you're going to be looking for some of those themes to think through. Okay, this is another way to look at Colossians. Any other thoughts about how you might sort of see the series approach, the big ideas, that before we get down to the messages, of how you could look at Colossians?
Yeah, I'm looking right now at an article from Preaching Today .com, and he has it divided up into 3 different ways. Colossians are Life in Christ, which is a 12-week series.
Wow.
I did 11, and his division and my division are very close.
Okay.
Honestly, the only difference is he did the last passage, 7 through 18, which I did not preach.
Right. There's a lot of names there, right?
Yeah, there's a couple differences in distinctions. And I also was ready for Advent. I had to end the series because of the next series. And then he divides up in one that focuses on Jesus Christ for 5 weeks, and that's through chapter 2, and then no longer who you were, 7 weeks, beginning with Colossians 3.
Right, I see that. Yeah.
So, and I was going to talk about when we get to when we go over what I did, you'll see that transition at chapter 3, verse 1.
Yeah. Well, why don't you break that down? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, the other thing I would think is Dale Bruner. I went to look for it on my shelf and couldn't find it, but it's there somewhere. Years ago, Dale Bruner, a professor, he later taught at Fuller Seminary for years. He was teaching at a college, I believe in the Philippines. I'm not 100% sure. And he was struggling from his Western culture, trying to teach what he called systematic theology. And he landed on the idea.
You might lay out what that is. I'm just trying to be careful not to use phrases that they may not know. So what in your mind is systematic theology?
Well, I never had it.
Well, I didn't either.
Systematic theology is where it's just gosh, how do I explain it? It's just a very comprehensive, total view of theology.
Yeah.
So, you hear those big words. I don't know, sanctification, justification, atonement. Of course, you're looking at God the Father, Jesus the Son, the Holy Spirit. And
you're trying to develop a system where that all fits together. It's consistent top to bottom. This is one big approach to all those many different topics. So anyway, I interrupted you.
Nope, that's fine. But he landed upon the Gospel of Matthew, and he ended up writing a 2-volume commentary on Matthew, in which he pieces together this theology. And it would be harder to do with Colossians, but you can certainly pick up certain theological themes.
Definitely.
In Colossians. I was going through it to see if I could come up with a systematic theology. I did it very quickly. I could not from Colossians, but there are some issues. You could do prayer. There's a lot about prayer.
There is.
In there. You could probably do a series on prayer just from Colossians.
I think, and that's something I've picked up. I've been reading through Colossians for devotional, and I've talked about how important devotional reading is, and I try not to do devotional reading just to get the next sermon series, but I've kept reading through Colossians devotionally in the last couple months in preparation for working through this. And that's one of the things that struck me as I've read this recently, is just how much either prayer there is in Colossians, or Paul is talking about prayer. So I think that's definitely a theme that you could talk about.
I think verses 1 through 14, chapter 1, the gospel. Then you pick up verse 15, of course, Christ, or Christ the Lord. The church, or the community of faith. Baptism. If you want to do a series on baptism, there's baptismal language in both chapter 2 and chapter 3. Not maybe a series on baptism, but including that in a comprehensive look at Colossians. And of course, the household, with the Hostafel, the household instructions, beginning with verse 18 of chapter 3. The Christian life, we'll talk more about that in my individual sermons. Anything else?
I think that's one of those things that if one or more of our students wants to give that a whirl as they try to put together a series, that'd be great. And as we do that, I've told Tim we're using WhatsApp, and we can get him involved in that too. And maybe you want to ask him a little bit about some of that. And we're glad to help out wherever we can. And as you form those series, because I know a lot of students will not have done that, and that may be the most difficult task that you face in this course. The writing the one sermon may be hard, but you might have done that. But coming up with a whole series may be a real challenge. So as you need help, don't be afraid to ask for help, and we'd both be glad, I think, to work with you on that.
Two things on that. One is I'm going to, in a few minutes, present what I preached on. Those titles are after the fact. They're not necessarily before the fact. And I work to parallel them. I work them to have them coherent with the series. But it required getting into the text and then thinking about how I can parallel this with other titles, which is an important theme for me.
So what you're saying is you didn't have all the titles in place Once you formed a series, you didn't necessarily have all the titles in place.
Certainly not in final form.
Right. And that happens. My sermon this week, we're thinking about missions, and it was just a two-week series. Last week was Equip, so getting people ready to do missions. And then I was going to call this week Send, the church sends missionaries. It ended up being Go, because my theme sort of changed, and I think we give ourselves freedom to do that. And if a series changes a little bit along the way, so be it, because the point there is we're trying to let the text speak to us. And if the text says something that, well, we were not expecting, or maybe in that cursory reading, preparing for the series, we thought this is what the text said, but then when you really study it, you find out, oh, it says something different. Well, I think we want to be faithful to what the text is really telling us. So those are always things that can change. And my guess is almost every series that I preach, I have the titles there, but at least one or two of them are going to change once I'm in the middle of it. So that just happens.
Well, and the second thing I would add to that, and you may have discussed this with your students already, you have to exegete your audience.
Right.
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 I was a basketball coach, and maybe too late, and maybe even after. If I were to coach today, I would say I am not a basketball coach. I coach students to play basketball.
Yeah. See, and I've said that many times in a couple different settings. I'm not a basketball coach, a basketball player, a basketball anything. So that's not the analogy I would use. But we're not teaching the Bible. That may be the subject matter, but you're teaching congregation, Christians, however you want to put that. You're teaching people. And I've stressed that with worship leaders that I work with too. I mean, you're not really leading worship. You're leading people to worship.
Yeah.
And that really is a different thing, because if I'm leading worship, it might be that I'm singing the songs I want to sing or doing the things that I'm comfortable with, but that may not be where the people who we're calling to worship, where they are. So you're right. Whether you're teaching, preaching, leading worship, whatever it is, you do have to exegete the audience and know where they are if you're going to take them to the place you want them to go, which may be a biblical truth, or maybe the presence of God, or whatever, we're talking about. So I think that's a valid point.
Yeah. James Earl Massey was a great preacher. And I sent James a sermon of his just yesterday from Colossians chapter 1. And he was also a teacher, preachers, and my twin brother had Massey as his professor of homiletics, one of his professor of homiletics. And Massey said you should never preach the same sermon twice, because you're preaching it to a very different congregation.
Right.
Now, I think that's an overstatement. I'm actually, hopefully none of my people see this, but I'm redoing a series I did 10 years ago. But you are preaching it differently because it's a different congregation.
Right.
You could preach the same text on Colossians, preach it a month later, and have a very different sermon.
Sure.
If something has changed in your congregation.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. Why don't you lay out sort of the structure of your series, Tim, if you will? And I know he's got some visual stuff that might help as well. And just go as far as you want with that, and then I'll chime in here and there, and then bring mine out a little bit.
I keep forgetting to hit that share button.
They're very used to me having to go back and forth because I keep forgetting to put either my face or put the graphic on. So you're doing better than I am already.
Are you seeing it?
Yes.
All right, this was our logo. You may have already shown them.
I have not. So.
All right. This was my entire series. And it started, I originally had the dates, but in terms of taking off, saving room, I took the dates off. I had a gap. That gap isn't intentionally there, but there was a guest speaker here in my series. And it went from, I think, the first Sunday of September of 2021 through the last Sunday before Advent.
So did your guest speaker cover that text or no?
No,
Okay.
he was a mission speaker.
Okay.
He was actually someone who's on the field in another country.
Okay.
So I rarely have people preach on, I did it early in my career and regretted it. And the people, we've got a couple good backup peoples and the people who can preach. One of them is an ordained minister and has had a long ministry. The other one might as well have been, because he's preached many times, but I rarely, if ever, ask a backup preacher when I'm gone to preach in the series.
Okay.
If I had a larger staff, people who preach more consistently, and I could talk about it and we could make sure we're on the same page.
Right.
Probably. So right. With all of these, you would see in the title the word complete. All right. So all of these are why we are complete. Well, right. We received the good news, 1 through 8. James, because we've been rescued, we'll look at the outline of these. 9 through 14. 9 through 14 was a text that I went, I got to preach that. You know, I mean, I can't just skip over it for me. And I'll say some things about the series, some things I wasn't crazy about, because Christ is supreme. You could preach an entire series, gentlemen, on 1:15 through 20.
You could.
Books. In fact, when I look at Marianne Thompson, we'll see that she gets some of her themes from that, because Christ changes us, right? So again, we're talking about sanctification is a theological word. Christ knits us. You want to lay
what that means, Tim, just real quick?
Yeah, it's not a word I use very often. It's just, right. It's the sanctified comes from the word to be made holy.
Right.
So it's how God makes us holy, how God changes us. These are not words I use very often, but I wouldn't use them. But as a student, I would want to know what they mean.
Right.
Because Christ knits us together, chapter 2, 1 through 7. That's the church, I think, or you could call it, it's called ecclesiology, right? The study of the church. You see how some of these big themes are involved. Because Christ wins the victory, right? Because Christ is the reality. That was, when you get to that text, that one was hard to come up with a title for.
Well, you know, and that's a transition point in the book, because at that point, Paul, we think, I mean, it's hard to tell exactly, and I'm using my best judgment here. I can't say I know this 100%, but it seems like at that point, he's beginning to deal with some false teaching that's out there, or at least some ideas that people have got that he does not agree with. And so I think the preaching changes at that point, and it becomes a little difficult, because maybe because that false teaching is not as active in our world today, so we're not addressing the same issue, or maybe just because the book takes a real turn there, it becomes a little hard to tie that whole theme. But anyway, yeah, I think that's part of the reason it's a little difficult.
Well, and commentators aren't sure what the heresy is, right?
No, they're not, right. I mean,
you'll probably talk about this, or we'll talk about it.
And I have a little bit, but you're right. I mean, we're making some guesses. And if you look at that stack of commentaries that you and I talked about, they do not all agree on what the issue is or who this group is that Paul may be dealing with. Where, as I said in my lecture, it's like hearing one side of a telephone conversation, right? We don't know what's being said on the other end. So we're having to put pieces together by what the person we're listening to is saying. So we don't know exactly. You're 100% right.
Yeah. Notice I mentioned it earlier, chapter 3, verse 1. Notice the transition in titles indicates there's a transition in the text. It's no longer believe, it's now behave.
Right.
Which is a common theme in Paul. It's very clear in Ephesians, which of course Ephesians and Colossians parallel each other in many ways. But it's often said Ephesians is two parts. Verses chapters 1 through 3 is believe, chapters 4 through 6 is behave, and how we live out our Christian lives. And you see some of that here. All right. And so when we put off the old, 1 through 11, when we put on the new, 12 through 17, and you could talk about it. Baptism is here along with earlier in chapter 2. When we live as a family, that's really the wives, husbands, servants. And I'll be interested when we get to that outline, because I don't remember how I handled that off the top of my head. But I think what I do is come up with some big themes of how we should live as people.
Right.
Respect.
Tim earlier called this
submission.
the household code, which is
Yeah.
somewhat technical term, but the point is, when we see it at work in ancient letters in general, and we see it at work in Ephesians, for example, Paul sort of addresses everybody in the household, and in that day that'd be husbands, wives, kids, slaves, and here's his masters and slaves, his instructions to them. So that's the section he's talking about there at the end of 3 and right at the beginning of 4. Go ahead.
And finally, when we redeem the time, 4 2 through 6. I did not, as we've already mentioned, preach 7 through 18. Part of that is because the material, in reading through it again today, I was like, oh, that's better stuff than I thought it was, maybe at the time. But a lot of it was time and series related. And your professor has asked you to do 6 through 8 sermons, so I flunked. Because I've got 11. So there you go.
I'm just trying to make it easy on them. See,
yeah,
I did 8, I guess. Yeah, I did 8.
Yeah. Let me add this, that I went to a workshop right as I was beginning the series on Colossians. And I was early on. I had just gotten through chapter 1. And I was talking to a preacher. She happens to be a female. And I mentioned that I had 4 sermons on Colossians 1, and she said, how? How? But if you get into the text, there's a lot there. There's a lot there. And I just mentioned the Preaching Today series where he did 12, so I feel better about myself there. Now you can get stuck on the text and maybe, start. We have a saying about not seeing the forest because of the trees. You can do that in preaching. And if I had a complaint about this series in the way I preached it, I thought I became enamored with exegeting the text and was probably weaker on applying it to everyday life. And it was very dense.
I think I could say similar things on that for this series as well, because at least as you go down to the middle of chapter 2, it's pretty dense theologically, right? I mean, Paul says some pretty heavy stuff, and I think it's easy for us at times to just read through that and say, oh yeah, I know Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. In him all things are created. Yeah, Jesus is great, right? He's God's son. We already know this. But then when you actually begin to take that apart and say the son is the image of the invisible God, and what does it mean for Paul to say that Jesus bears God's image, a God that we can't see, we see through the image that is Jesus? What does that mean? And then you recognize, well, Paul's not just heaping some stuff on here to make Jesus sound really cool and awesome. He's saying some very important things about who Jesus is. So it's easy to get caught up in that. And I felt like I did a little of that too, just because Paul is saying so much in these passages, and you don't want to just leave that out or skip over some important things he's getting at. So
Well,
anyway,
when you see the way I outline 9 through 14, chapter 1, 9 through 14, you'll see how dense it is. Dense is a word. Hopefully everyone understands what I'm saying, how thick it is.
you packed a lot into just to,
Yes.
and
Each word means something.
That's right.
Each word, I mean, not that each word doesn't always mean something, but in narrative, it's, it's one kind of preaching. But when you get into the letters and the epistles, and by the way, does any other religious group spend time exegeting letters from an individual to a particular person in history?
Yeah.
That's a very unique challenge that we have.
It is.
But real quickly, let me share this and then we can,
go ahead.
You can do your next step. This is Marianne Thompson. James and I were discussing earlier. I don't know how to pronounce her middle name. So her maiden name, and meaning her name before she was married. But these are the themes that she develops in her commentary. In him, all things were created. And so Jesus in creation, all things hold together in him, making peace through the blood of his cross. So atonement, or the cross. And she talks about atonement, and also the atonement theory of Christus Victor, which means the victory of Christ. And we see that in the hymn. You who were once estranged, he is reconciled. Our relationship to God and other people in the church, hidden with God in Christ, who we are as individual believers. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with love. I don't know exactly which verse is, but that's, again, community life.
Right.
So that just gives you some of these themes are picked up in what James and I preach. We may just not have developed it in that way. And I'm going to stop my share.
Well, right. I mean, there is only so much time. And people can only take so much in a Sunday morning, and when Paul is saying all these things in just 15 through 20, or you could echo that in chapter 2, the middle of the chapter 6 down to 17 or 15, it would be really hard to tell everyone everything that Paul is saying. So you got to pick and choose. That's part of preaching, I think. So is there anything else you'd want to say about the series as a whole, Tim?
Just one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me share my screen again. And this comes from preachingtoday.com. This is kind of talking about what we've already talked about. Sorry, I had to find where the start share button was. Where am I? There I am. Share. All right. Slideshow from current slide. So we can see it. Why is that not doing that? Sorry, because I was flipping on the wrong one, clicking on the wrong one. So this is the way, I believe it's Jeff Arthur's, no, it's Steve Walker, somebody else, but this was on Preaching Today. Just another way of seeing the big picture. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Right?
Yeah.
So encouragement and prayer, 1 through 14, Christ, what Christ means to you. So applying it, so that he calls that the core connection, which is the heresy of Christ plus something else. A new life for the new you. That sounds like a whole new series that he did. I don't know. Living warily in this world. Warily means, I don't know. How would you describe warily? Just observant?
Oh, see, I'm not sure exactly what he means on that. Is that,
Yeah.
observe? I see what you're saying, observant. Yeah, so you have some, you're a little wary, right? You're a little concerned, and so you don't jump in. You're watching from a distance, maybe.
And then you'll notice right here, correcting wrong thinking, correcting wrong living.
Right.
That's what we talked about, the believe and the behave. All right. So believe that Jesus is enough. That's complete. Reject spiritual add-ons. This is this middle section that he deals with. And then base your behavior on life in Christ. So I just ran across that. I thought it was
Yeah, I think that's
a similar to what we've talked about, but slightly different.
right.
Right.
In my series, I mean, my series is shorter. It's 8 weeks. Again, the same theme, complete. And my titles, I tend to have shorter titles. I mean, if you look down my preaching schedule, a lot of times titles are 1, 2, 3 words, and each one of these was 1 word. So for the beginning, the word was goal. So what's the goal in us becoming complete? Our identity, and the identity of Christ, which changes us in 1:15 to 20. How we are changed. And then we talk about victory, and that would be Jesus' victory. And that ties into some of the things that Tim was just saying.
What verses are those?
That's down to 2:6-15. You refer to it on 1:15 to 20, I think, but the theme of Christus Victor runs all the way through in my mind, this book, or at least the first couple chapters. Talk about the focus, and that's, where is our focus? Is our focus on keeping rules? Or is our focus going to be on Jesus? And then we get into that more application section where I talked about choice and allowing the completeness that we find in Christ to create the right character in us, the direction of our lives, and then our conversation in 4:2-6. So I think the best way for us to do that, because my one word don't tell us that much, is to just jump in, and we'll get as far as we can. And as I said, this is a lot to talk about. And it might be that we have to hold a piece for next time. If we do, we do. But let's jump in those first couple of sermons. And for Tim, the first sermon was it 1:1-8? Is that where you were, Tim?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did 1:1-8.
And then 9-14.
9-14 and 15-20.
And that was just 2 sermons for me. I did 3-14 and then 15-20. And 3-14 is a lot of material. And I cannot say that I covered it all. I mean, that was certainly not my goal. I just, in trying to do 8 weeks is what I was trying to do. So there's really no way to cover all that material.
And your title was Goal?
Goal, yeah. So why don't you start, Tim, and tell us what you did with those 2 messages.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again.
Yeah.
And slideshow. All right. So 1-8, because we've received the good news, the word gospel shows up. 4 qualities of the good news. The good news is true. You've heard in the word of truth, the gospel, verse 5. The good news generates hope, the faith and love that spring from the hope. The good news bears fruit. All over the world, this gospel is bearing fruit. And the good news is to be shared. I pick up this theme of Epaphras, our dear fellow servant who told you the good news. And of course, here the implication is what Epaphras is doing, we are to do.
Right, sure.
So can I say one word about, well,
Yeah.
It's more than one word, but an additional comment about preaching style or preaching. I did not, when we looked at books in the previous discussion, commentaries, homiletical books, I did not mention Rick Warren's book, which was very popular in the 90s, The Purpose-Driven Church. He wrote one that became a huge bestseller called The Purpose-Driven Life. That one I've never read, but The Purpose-Driven Church, he talks about rather than just having an outline and the outline being parallel, which I still try it to be, wanting it, I don't know if this is exactly his words, but it should be active. It should be something that the person should do. And I heard a famous preacher in our churches in America named Bob Russell in a workshop in February or March, drawing a blank on when it was. And I never really thought about this. Russell was has been an influence on my preaching, but he talks about, his point wasn't the exegesis, it was the application. And so all of his points would be how you're to live this out.
Mhm.
And that's really very similar to
Yeah.
my preaching style for the most part. It doesn't quite show forth in a sermon like this, which is maybe one of the reasons why I thought it was a little bit heavy on exegesis and light on application. But we're trying to get to that point. All right, you want me to go to the second sermon, or you want to
go ahead.
talk about your sermon?
No, go ahead and do both those. That's fine. Let's do that, and then I'll come back. Yeah.
So second sermon, 1:9-14, because we've been rescued. Again, we're talking about what's the church sometimes called atonement, justification, which is being made right. The language is not strong. That's Roman language, but it's reconciliation is here in Colossians. So I developed the theme. There was a movie, there's a TV show in Denmark, believe it or not, that I found a reference to, and it was called Trapped. And so I talk about this. We are no longer trapped. And I, this is coming not very long in America after the pandemic. We all felt trapped, quarantined, etc. So we're no longer trapped. And I divided this into 3 sections. What God does for us. He has qualified us. Verse 12, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you. We're no longer trapped. God has rescued us, for he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness. Verse 13, he has transferred us, brought us in the New International Version, carries the idea. I don't like that translation. I'm not sure. I use 1984 NIV because it's my Bible.
Okay.
So I prefer the updated New International Version, which is 2011. All right. But it carries the idea of being transferred from one dominion into another. And here you can see it. He has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and has transferred us into the kingdom of the Son he loves. So that's what God does for us. What God does in us, God fills us. All right, here's verse 9. Asking God to fill you with the knowledge of his will. All right, God empowers us. Being strengthened with all power, verse 11. So what God does for us, what God does in us, I don't know why in's not underlined there, and how we respond. And in a lot of my messages, the third point is how we respond, whether I put it that way or not.
Right.
That's the direction I'm headed. So walking worthily, we should say by walking worthily, in order that you may live a life worthy of the Lord, and by living thankfully. And by the way, Thanksgiving is huge in Colossians, another theme. I don't know if we've mentioned it, but it could easily be a theme. All right. That's the sermons through verse 14.
Okay. And as we've said, I looked at just one sermon on this and definitely didn't do the whole passage justice, but my preaching is a little different from Tim's in that Tim tends to be more outline oriented, where I tend to try to come to one main point. Now, with that said, I think one way they're probably more similar than they might appear if I just put mine on the screen like Tim's, is that I have a main point, but then oftentimes my application ends up being 2 or 3 points, which is very much like Tim's third point, which is sort of application. So
right.
Even though if you read them, you'd say these look like very different styles, they're probably not quite as different as that looks like from the outside, but on the inside, the pieces are really sort of all there.
And I would say this, that your exegesis of the text that's not always as clear that you're doing that,
right?
But you are.
Right, it's there, yeah.
It's very textual but it's just not a traditional.
Right, it's not done in that outline sort of form, but it is a big chunk in the middle of the sermon where I'm talking about the text and what the text has to say to us, but trying to get to that main point rather than walking through several points in an outline. And as I said in the lecture on Introduction to Preaching, these are really just multiple ways to preach. It is not as though one is right and all the others are wrong. I mean, we talked about that when we went through the books on preaching, where Craddock has a different approach from Lowry, which is different from sort of the standard, if you will, of Haddon Robinson. All these are varying approaches, but it's not as though one is right and the rest are wrong, but may all be good tools to have in your toolbox. My point was that God is far from finished with you. And the idea is God is making you complete, and he's not done. And there are times when we feel really incomplete. I mean, we look in our lives and feel like there's some stuff that's really missing. And I think most of us have encountered that sense that because of our sin, or because we've not really worked on something, we've let it slide, there's incompleteness there, but that God is at work in that. And that keyed in on chapter 1, 3 through 5, where Paul talks about their faith, their love that comes from their hope. And we talked about that in the lecture on this passage, how I think that's very interesting language, that faith and love would come from hope. And the way that I understand that is that maybe this is more faithfulness, which springs from our hope, that because we know that we can have hope in what God is doing, we remain faithful, and then we show love. So then that God is at work in leading us to that sense that he's not done, that there's more work to be done. And then those 4 things that show up in 9 through 12, where it comes together it bears fruit in good works, it grows in the knowledge of God, it's strengthened with the power of God, and gives thanks to God. Now, again, that was all in the section where I'm doing exegesis, but it doesn't feel as much like that. And then the application comes. Well, how do we allow God to be at work in us? If God is making us complete, what are some things that, even though this is the work of God, we can allow it to foster it in us? So we're growing in this. Allow his word to challenge you. So it's about God's word. Allow God to be at work in you, and then work toward a worthy life. We don't do that on our own, but we do that with the power of God. So we're talking about, for me, what's the goal? The goal is to be transformed by the power of God, to be made more complete. And these are the things that we can do to make that happen. You know what? We were going to talk about 1:15 to 20, but we really only have about 8 or 9 minutes, and that's just not enough, I don't think, for us to really deal with that passage, because I think it's so important. So I think it will hold that, and then Tim and I we'll be able to finish out the next passage too, but I really want to allow us to have plenty of time to talk about what I see as one of the key passages in Colossians. So any parting shots, Tim, on just getting up to verse 14, or maybe another way to approach it? I still think another way to approach that is to talk a lot about, and I do talk some, but to talk a lot about hope and how hope does transform us. And there's a sermon that could be done on that as well. But
Well,
anyway.
actually, one of the things I'm trying to remember where I found it, but it was in my notes, and I thought I would do more with it than I did. But someone somewhere talks about hope based on Colossians.
Yeah.
And it's another underlying theme. I'd ask you a question, which is, did you use it? Is that first sermon kind of an introductory sermon?
Yeah.
To the entire series?
It is, definitely. And I tend to do that. And I don't even necessarily do it on purpose, but that theme is probably in my head. And a lot of times, about halfway through, I realize I'm talking as much about this whole series as I am this one text. So that's definitely something I find myself doing, even if it's not purposeful, if it's not intentional, put it that way.
I don't do that, but I always have an extended, always is a strong word. I usually have an extended introduction to the series tacked onto the first sermon. I can remember sometime in the recent past, I said something about a sermon, that was a little long. And I have shortened quite a bit since COVID. I used to preach. James is always, you've been in what, 18 to 22
18
minutes?
to 20, something like that.
Yeah. And I've for years preached 30 to 35, which is in our culture, probably too long. But anyhow, I mentioned about a first sermon in a series being too long, and my daughter said, well, you introduce the series and that sermon's always longer.
Well, I mean,
So
it
she had
tends to
picked up
be.
on it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I tend to do exactly the same thing. Again, always is probably too strong a word, but it is a rare series that I don't spend some time introducing the series in the first message. I mean, if you're going to do a series, you might as well have it make sense, right? So you got to talk about it a little bit.
With some series, you're repeating what you're doing in terms of the series, but it's much briefer. I always, in our culture, I don't assume the person was there the week before.
Right. And I used to, but I don't as much anymore.
I did too.
Yeah. And I didn't always. I tend now to bring up the series in subsequent sermons. So not the first one, but the rest of the series. I tend to bring up the series earlier than I used to give people an idea of what where we are, so they're not just trying to figure out what does this even mean. Sometimes I feel like that's not as good a way to bring someone into a sermon.
Yeah.
But I don't want them to be lost either,
Yeah. I tend to repeat. If I may be overkill in that, I do have a tendency to review where we've been in almost every sermon.
Well, I do a lot
because of that.
Yeah.
So, and I would say for both of us, this series on Colossians was longer than we normally preach. It definitely was for you.
Yeah. Because I'm usually 4 to 6, and this was 8. Okay,
Mine
we
was
will
11.
pick up in chapter 1, verse 15 in our next discussion. The lectures will continue right along in the schedule, but we'll pick that up so we can spend a little time talking about that. And we hope it was helpful.